I want to talk about the sort of rising rate of narcissism and the finger pointing that's going on, where we seem to be doing an awful lot of projecting these narcissistic traits onto each other. I want to explore what are the criterion for being a narcissist, the spectrum of narcissism, how we can show up as being a little bit more narcissistic in certain circumstances, how we might have traits of narcissism and how would we know that, and ultimately what we might need to do to make the rate of narcissism a little bit less moving forward. Hi, I'm Clarissa Mosley. I'm a psychologist and a psychotherapist, and I'm very aware of the trend of people pointing fingers at each other, telling them they are narcissists. We've all become an armchair psychologist these days, and we're cherry-picking things that we've heard on the internet because narcissism seems to be the biggest slur word that we can call another person these days. But when we're only picking out individual traits, are we actually seeing more narcissists, or are we projecting our desire to call other people names, people that we don't quite like in that moment? Narcissism proper needs to be diagnosed, and the problem with diagnosing narcissists is that they don't think they have a problem. So part of the DSM criteria is that there's an enduring problem over time that is interfering with functioning and daily living. Now, to meet that criteria, people have to be bothered by their own narcissism, and usually they're not, because the ability to have self-insight isn't really happening in true narcissism. So I want to explore what are the criterion for being a narcissist. A narcissist, if we break down the letters into an acronym, will spell out NARCISSIST. And so N will stand for no empathy. Narcissists have no empathy. They do not have the ability to see into the minds of others, feel what they might be feeling, and really care from a deep, sensate level that indicates that they desire other people not to suffer. This lack of being able to project or have the empathy and the mindsight for another is a hallmark of narcissism in any form. The next letter, A, stands for this need for attention, admiration, and a certain arrogance. So a grandiose narcissist will have an arrogance about them, or the more covert one will certainly have ways of finding attention for themselves by their suffering. R stands for responsibility, 0. There is little to no ability to take self-responsibility for oneself or one's actions, wrongdoings, lies, misadventures. All of those things are not present in somebody with narcissistic personality disorder. It's always somebody else's fault. C is for controlling and manipulation, another feature of narcissism. I won't go into that. It can manifest in many different forms. I is about I am special, I am important, I am entitled. S is how the superiority and grandiosity manifests. S is also for the superficiality. And in the covert narcissism, it's also in the suffering of the victim mentality of the covert narcissist. I is for the intolerance, the impatience, and the irritability. Narcissists don't like to be kept waiting. They don't like to be told they're wrong. They don't like to be overseen or overlooked in any way. S is for supply. All narcissists need supply. Their identity is upheld by the opinions of others. And T is for the twisting of reality. And this can come in the form of the dishonesty and the manipulation, of the gaslighting, of the flying monkey stories about what other people think about you because I'm not wrong if I'm the narcissist, and I will twist reality and tell you something didn't happen until I'm blue in the face. I just want to ponder the question about, are there actually more narcissists in the world, or are we overdiagnosing people and each other? Let's go back to that aspect of responsibility, because if somebody is caught in a lie, often we will get defensive. Many people's first call is to make up a little story to get themselves out of trouble. A lot of people have issues with conflict, and so they might tell a porcupine if they're caught in a lie. The difference is that a narcissist will double down on the lie. They will not go away and have time to cool down, think things through, and go, yeah, you're right, I did a wrong thing, and I'm sorry. I am sorry are words that seldom come out of a narcissist's mouth. And so the ability for humility is something that we need to keep an eye out for in people that we might be labeling as narcissists. Do they have the integrity and the authenticity to acknowledge their faults, to admit when they've done something wrong, to question with curiosity if the story that you're telling could be true? Because I know that people with high amounts of empathy run over these kinds of thoughts in their heads incessantly. People with higher amounts of empathy will replay situations and stories in their head in order to work out if they did the wrong thing. Now, we've got to be careful that this isn't a manifestation of covert narcissism, where there's a sense of, oh, I've always done the wrong thing and I'm the bad one and I'm always to blame, and it gets quite exaggerated. It's like a little bit disproportionate often to the actual crime itself. The other thing that we can get confused about is someone's ability for empathy. Covert narcissists in particular can show up as being quite a philanthropist, quite charitable, they seem to be very empathic. So let's look at the difference between cognitive empathy and true feeling, sensate, emotional empathy. Anyone can watch a terrible news story on the television and go, oh, that should have never happened. Those poor people. Anyone can have the thought that what they're seeing is wrong, and they can act caring and sympathetic. So this can be very confusing. If you see someone that you think's a narcissist doing this and you're like, oh, well, like I saw them, they give huge amounts to charity. They show up on Christmas Day and serve the homeless people lunch. Well, are they posting that on Instagram? Is that something they're bragging about? That's where we start to ask questions. Are they doing that out of the goodness of their heart, or are they doing it to show up as being a good person? Are they looking at the terrible news story because they genuinely care? Can they go into a story about how it might have been, for example, for the relatives of the person who was hurt? And the other thing that you need to also look at is that story something that's really relevant to them? Because what I've observed is a lot of people have got empathy for things that they've personally experienced. I've seen people that could potentially have more narcissistic traits getting really upset about the dog dying in the movie. They don't really care too much about the people. They don't care about the other tragedies, but they really get upset about the dog dying. And I think that's interesting, particularly if they've lost a dog. Now, it's not to say that people with narcissism can't love or have attachments, but it's just not done in a way that is sort of transferable or generalizable. There's often a little bit of an inappropriateness if you watch them closely. So don't be fooled, particularly if you're an empathic person, by projecting your empathy onto the narcissist and thinking you know what they're feeling and thinking, or watching them doing one of these little sneaky maneuvers and sort of saying, oh, well, they clearly have empathy because they took flowers to their sick mother in the hospital. Yeah. So basically what I'm exploring here is there a higher incidence of narcissism, or are we more likely to project these little cherry-picked bits of information that we've heard offline or understood from others that are calling their partners and their exes narcissists and going, oh, yes, I know someone, or my guy does that, or my ex-girlfriend did that, and I'm pretty sure she was a narcissist. And really, what does that do for us? So it appears that the incidence of narcissism is a lot higher than we would think. And this goes back to the inability to accurately diagnose the true amount of narcissists in the world, because they will not come in for treatment and diagnosis. So we kind of are left to the mercy of information and lay people, non-professionals, getting ideas and information and speculating about narcissists. So I went through a lot of the traits in the beginning with my acronym. But the other thing is that we need to be aware that a narcissist might be the first one to call somebody else a narcissist. I've heard of this happening quite a bit, because a narcissist can really easily watch the same videos on Instagram and YouTube and go, that's what you do. Right? Because remember, they're blameless. No flies on them, no responsibility. It's always somebody else's fault. They could easily be projecting their own narcissistic tendencies or what they think is somebody else's fault onto somebody. The other situations where this can go awry is that all of us have got some element of narcissism. All of us have got some of these traits that might show up under extreme, pressurized circumstances or at our worst times. There are certain high stress points in our life. We might be rushing, we might be late, we might be struggling, we might not have had any sleep, and we can blurt out something that sounds impatient and demanding. We could be hangry and the waiter's ignoring us and we're like, whoa, why don't they come and see us? The person sitting with us is going, that's what narcissists do. They get impatient with the waiters. Well, that's where we've got to take a broad view of things. There are certain circumstances and situations where people will show up as being more narcissistic. One of these is in early stage dating, where everyone is trying to put their best impression forward. You might go on a date with someone and they just talk about themselves the whole way through. Are they narcissistic, or are they trying to convince you that they're a really good option for dating? That's a good question. You might get a little bit further down in the dating or in the relationship where there's a jostling and a battling for getting one's needs met. And this is where people can become divided in their own courts, and especially after arguments where they can get maybe a little bit less nice than they would be not in an argument, and say things and act in ways that can look pretty narcissistic. When we want our needs met and possibly under stress or in an argument or under threat of losing a relationship, or when we've been hurt or feel wronged, we might regress a little bit and we might go back into a state that is more childlike and appears more narcissistic to the other person or even to ourselves. That's a good question. If we can ask if we are narcissistic, does that mean that we're not, or does that mean that we are? If we can ask the question, am I a narcissist, is it kind of like saying, well, if you can ask if you're crazy, you're probably not, because crazy people don't know they're crazy. I think not. I think there are varying degrees of narcissism and narcissistic traits in many of us. We certainly exist in a culture where being narcissistic is kind of prized. So we can show up as being more narcissistic, and we can do things, as I mentioned before, in our lesser moments, in our not best self times, that can actually look pretty narcissistically oriented. We can be stompy or demanding or impatient or seem kind of self-centered. We can blow around horn too much in social situations. We can talk badly about other people, possibly if we get involved in gossip. We can seem controlling, and controllingness can come from different avenues. Like anxious people can be quite controlling. They want to know where they're going, and it's a little bit of a different kind of control, but anyone could say, oh, they're being very controlling and this and that, and therefore they're narcissistic. So if you're questioning yourself, if you're narcissistic, then you've got to go through all these traits and ask, how often do you do them? To what extent? How long you might have been that way? And do you have any counter abilities? Are you really empathic, but you can get kind of a little bit victim-y about things? I don't know if that's narcissism. So it's not necessarily so that to question one's own narcissism excludes that you are a narcissist, but it can be an indicator that you are less likely to be a narcissist, because in the extreme grandiose sense, most narcissists wouldn't even think there was anything wrong with them. But if you slide the spectrum down to sort of moderate amounts of narcissism, well, yeah, maybe you are a little bit under certain circumstances. And then the key thing would be to ask, does that information and that insight, does the recognition of these narcissistic traits in you create a desire for change? And do you actually go about any steps initiating change? Because the whole point of self-insight is to sort of look at what you're doing that might not necessarily be good for you or other people and change it. And that's the reason why we have empathy and concern and care for other people, is that we want to do right by them so we can live in a cooperative society and not one that's ruled by competition, ruthlessness, and getting one over other people. Obviously, those kinds of people are more likely to be narcissists. So, are there more narcissists? Unfortunately, I think there are. There is an expert who speaks a lot on YouTube that will put the rate of narcissism between 20 and 50% of the population. Now, that sounds like a lot, but when we look at human development and the different pathways we can take in the very early days, I can actually see how that might be an accurate estimate. When we are developing as children, we've got a certain set of traits and abilities, and we've got this function of empathy, which is often missing in some people through various mechanisms. If we are not encouraged in the empathy, or we don't have the brain structures that are being supported in growing this empathy, or if somehow it's destroyed through trauma, toxins, brain injury, many things can actually take our empathy and our ability to be kind, caring, and considerate and wanting the best for others. And a lot of things can take that offline. And so then we can go in this other direction, which is more narcissistic. We will develop a false shell of a personality that's driven to gain what it can from the environment through manipulative strategies that aren't pro-social always, because narcissists tend to do a little bit of damage to other people. And this is due to their lack of concern or ability to understand the needs, the wants, the feelings of another person, and to feel that on a caring, emotional, empathic level. But in terms of that development in the early days, if something goes wrong and we don't diverge towards narcissism, I think the other avenue we diverge in towards is being overly empathic. Now, being overly empathic can lead you to be more people-pleasing, to be wired up in a more codependent way, to be so dependent on other people for your sense of self-worth that it can look a little bit narcissistic. It's like your value is outsourced in both of these occasions. In the narcissist, it's outsourced in the way of needing supply and admiration and accolades and to be right all the time. And in the people-pleasing and codependent way, it's outsourced in your ability to be of use to other people, to make them happy. And of course, a narcissist and a codependent people pleaser fit together really nicely because they've got this complementary way of being. Now, obviously, there are varying degrees amongst these two different extremes that I think we could go in our development. It's certainly not absolute. There are many different ways that we can emerge, and we can have little specklings of things in between. But I think we definitely live in a society that values and promotes narcissism. And it's not rocket science to work out what that is. I think as soon as the iPad came to be, as soon as social media became a thing, there's this externalization of value, and there's this ability to create a glossy, shiny image and a false image of self. And there's actually a pressure to do that, to be and look a certain way, and to have these things that are marketed towards us, that capitalism tells us that we must have to be of any value as a human. And so these are kind of shallow, superficial, ruthless, narcissistic traits and ways of being. So I think it's important, if we become aware of that we actually really make a conscious effort to return to truly human values. And human values are pro-social. They are caring about other people in our world and our environment. They are not a source of competition or comparison. They are a source of compassion and care. If you are aware that you feel you might be a little bit narcissistic yourself, then you can make a conscious effort to promote these qualities. But if you're projecting onto other people that they're a narcissist and they're the bad, wrong ones, and if this is something that's happening a lot, and there's not a lot of evidence in the person across time and space, you don't know them well enough to actually say they're a bona fide narcissist, it's really a projection, then it's behoving on you to question why that might be. Because I think a lot of people might be getting mislabeled simply because they've had a lapse in behavior, or they haven't shown up very well, or they've been under a lot of pressure, or they've been basically gaslit into being a narcissist, or they've been set up because somebody's got it in for them. So it's a grey area. So I hope you've enjoyed this discussion on the rising rate of narcissism and the different traits that should be there if you are going to call someone a narcissist, and the question about your own narcissism and how we might change this moving forward. If you've enjoyed this, please hit the like button. If you want to hear more from me, hit subscribe. And thank you for sharing this time with me.